if I am asked casually in the street by a passerby, a friend or not, what are you studying? What are you doing? And I'd say, I'm investigating Töpffer. They might answer, who? Töpffer? Who is that? And I would, in a few words, answer, only the inventor of the modern comic strip.
Thank you for tuning in to The Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. In the winter of 1831, when Goethe was feeling a little blue, one of his loyal attendants, Frederick Sauret, placed some illustrated manuscripts by a taciturn Genevan scholar into Goethe's hands, attempting at a therapeutic distraction. Thankfully, the gamble paid off. Goethe found the book very amusing, as it gave him extraordinary pleasure, though he chose to take this pleasure in small doses so as not to suffer an indigestion of ideas. Sauret also noted that Goethe thought the Genevan sparkled with talent and wit, and if he did not have such an insignificant scenario before him, he would invent things which would surpass all our expectations. The Genevan in question was Rodolphe Töpffer, the inventor of comic strip. With me today is Dr. David Kunzle, professor of art history at UCLA from 1976 until his 2009 retirement. Professor Kunzle is a prolific author and one of the founding fathers of contemporary comic scholarship. Among his writings on popular political and public art, he is best known for his compilation and translation of Töpffer's comic strips named Rodolphe Töpffer, the complete comic strips, along with his monograph called Father of the Comic Strip, Rodolphe Töpffer. Hello, David. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, which lay a little in my distant past, speaking from now, but which abide with me.
So David, when Goethe attempted to describe what he found so revolutionary in Töpffer's work, he primarily observed that the sequential pictures suggest movement, which I quote him, freezes and unfreezes in the spirit of imitation. So it is in this kind of awkward but prescient observation that Goethe nails the strange mechanism Töpffer had stumbled on and finds metaphoric resonance with one of his own utterances, namely, architecture is frozen music. So I wonder how you would summarize Töpffer's overall mechanism.
First of all, Töpffer discovered that his way of sketching very sketchily and showing it to people made them laugh. He had a way of turning this all to comic effect. And he began scribbling the beginning of a story, which became the middle of a story, and the end became a whole story, and allowed or encouraged even the students in his class, he was a schoolmaster by profession, to take a peek at what he had drawn, and they laughed loud. And soon they were followed by Töpffer's friends, the intimate circle in Geneva, which was a very educated circle, and admired already this man for his writing abilities. They admired Töpffer already for little prose pieces he had written, and they discovered that he could also draw in this novel fashion. Brilliant, flighty sketches which were constantly in movement, and nobody had been able to do that in sequences of drawings, inspired perhaps by Hogarth, who of course did not do sketchy series of drawings, but very finished ones. Töpffer, by contrast, left them in sketchy form, and this was quite revolutionary.
Töpffer's essay on physiognomy, written in the year 1845, attempts at theorizing the basic principles to visual storytelling and line drawing. As he wrote, here I quote, "The faces you doodle are, after all, alive. They talk, laugh, and cry before you know it. You have on the paper a whole society within whom you can converse. Almost invariably, one discovers, too, that if some of these patterns are thrown together, a diverting scene can ensue. So you bring them together and add others, find a scene that went just before, devise the next, and there you are on the road of making a picture story," unquote. Elsewhere he wrote, here I quote, The drawings without the text would only produce an obscure meaning. The text without the drawings would mean nothing. It is their combination that forms a kind of a novel." Unquote. Could you enlighten us on how the concept of line drawing came about? What does it mean exactly? What elements lay at the core of Töpffer's storytelling rhetorics?
We know quite exactly how and why Töpffer developed this sketchy line drawing effect, which undergirds all of his picture stories, while he was at the same time doing different kinds of drawings, landscape and characters and all sorts of subjects. But the picture stories are in this characteristic line drawing and dessin au trait in French. By his late teens, Töpffer, expecting to go perhaps to an art school to refine his natural talent for drawing, discovered he had weak eyesight, which could not endure continuous work, exacting work on the page. As he tells us himself, very movingly, "I found that it was only when I allowed my pencil to take off of its own accord, to fly off in any direction it wanted. It was only when I let the pencil loose on the page that I could create the characters and the adventures for those characters that would become a graphic novel at its best." Graphic novels can be very, very long, but for Töpffer, they were short, up to 70, 80 pages, but certainly that was more than anyone could manage in the 19th century. And the line drawing was much admired for the effects it could produce of immediacy and spontaneity and previsibility and foreseeability of the adventures that these characters and the way they get each other, they get themselves mixed up. This wonderful way in which Töpffer mixes his characters literally by changing their clothes or changing their actions. Constantly shifting is one of the extraordinary things about Töpffer, is where the geography melts in front of our eyes. You don't know where people are quite. You know what they're feeling and thinking and doing, but you don't know where they are. That is magic. The other element is, as the very term of the treatise he wrote to explain this, essay on physiognomy. It's actually in French physiognomy, in English just essay on physiognomy. Starts really with faces. What do these faces, what do these heads, what do these expressions portend? Töpffer would draw a single funny face and he realized, hey, this is a kind of funny face which is going to do crazy things. This, for instance, is a man who's going to be henpecked by his wife when it comes to the education of his children. I can see that in the very face that I have scribbled without even thinking what I was doing. This is a face which had character, peculiar and often ridiculous and adventurous, which I could throw about in my imagination and generate laughter. The comic strip is always about adventure. The comic strip, to engage in the variety and fun and unforeseeabilities of the adventures that the hero got engaged in, and how the other characters enter into those adventures as well. This is a matter of letting your imagination run free. You just loosen the bridle and maybe you apply the spurs if need be in order to make your imagination run faster, but you have to let it go of its own accord, as it were. So the idea of the term the unconscious, which Töpffer is very sparing in the use of, but the idea of the unconscious taking over, which is very much part of our psychology today, and very much part of the modern novel, which is so often psychological in the deepest sense, or a series of psychologies of different characters. This is really embedded in Hogarth's narrative method. And the glory of it is that you never know where he's going. Töpffer. To take one example, they've taken off their clothes, a swim in a river, and somebody's going to pick up those clothes and pretend to be them, or pretend to be somebody else at any rate than they were before they found these clothes by chance and left their clothes behind, which are then picked up and put on by the swimmer when he gets out of the water, and finds himself mistaken for that character, which leads to hilarious mésentente.
Right. Well, who has thought about a once low-status art form so looked down upon that it has to circulate underground can one day win the heart of a million? In your monograph on Töpffer, you mentioned that even though Töpffer had to sell his picture stories underground, they did gain him traction during his lifetime, enabling him to make a few bucks out of these little books. However fearful Töpffer was of retribution for indulging in such tomfoolery as caricature, and however worried he was about how it would weigh on the career of a freshly minted university professor, he nevertheless grew cautiously bolder after Goethe's encouragement, right? Passing out his hand-drawn books to select aristocrats until it was generally known that the Genevan RT was the author of those amusing picture books that everyone, especially Goethe was talking about. One of the original manuscripts even includes a handwritten exhortation to the following words: "Please avoid crumbling, dirtying, or pulling the pages about, being careful to turn only by the edge." So how did Europe, and particularly Goethe, become instantly smitten with Töpffer? Especially concerning that Goethe is one of the greatest literary figures at the time, who represented and endorsed really the serious undertone of European academia. Is it by chance? Did Töpffer get famous because of Goethe? How did Töpffer's silly caricatures, let's say, even manage to make it all the way to Weimar?
Well, Goethe represents much more than the serious face of the Academy. He was a man of the greatest versatility, and even one of his best-known, best-translated productions like Faust is full of humour. It's not embedded in humour like Töpffer stories would be, but there is a humorous slant to quite a bit of writing in Goethe, and he certainly enjoyed a joke. He certainly was looking out, this is an important point, looking out perhaps for somebody who would take humour more seriously than he, who appreciated it but did not deploy it in a consistent and deliberate way that Töpffer did. He was looking for somebody to take literature in a different direction at the time. He saw himself as a sort of sponsor of new talents, as detecting the marshal's baton in the knapsack of the general. I mean, that's a figure of no account, as he certainly was for the world at large, like Töpffer, a little schoolmaster in Geneva, could make a new army of thoughts, of thinking, out of these small beginnings. And by skillful manipulation of them, and also by skillful dissemination of them, because Töpffer did not publish in the normal way, he had his drawings put into lithographic form and then published by himself at his expense, but at an expense which was actually very profitable to him, because he figured that the cost of one album to him was 1 franc, perhaps, at the cost of paper, and not much more. And he was able to sell these little books. And they are quite small booklets. All his 7 or 8 comic strips are quite small bulk, 80 pages at the most, and they could be sold for 10 francs, which was the price of a well-made album by a major artist at the time.
And you, of course, David, have held these original volumes, many of them in your hands, just like you might have spent a couple of francs in buying one. And I heard that all those books, the archival of Töpffer papers, have all gone recently to the Getty as bequest from you. Is that right?
The first editions of Töpffer have become highly desirable articles on the market, very seldom appearing in the market, and when they do, fetching extraordinarily high prices. It's 5, occasionally even 6 figures. But the subsequent republications are what you can find in the general way, which have been republished in collections and which are still original Töpffers. They're not degraded. And one of the advantages of line drawing is that it reproduces well compared with other kinds of more academic drawing, where the lines tend to get blurred. And the Getty, yes, very happily. I hope it made them as happy as it did me to release to such an institution this huge collection of Töpffer editions and related materials, because he did all kinds of other work, novels he wrote himself, for instance. That Töpffer's entire oeuvre is now well represented in the Getty, which before I gave these books really didn't know who Töpffer was, and now they do.
Go, little book, and choose your world for crazy things. Those who do not laugh, yawn, and those who do not yield, resist, and those who reason are mistaken, and those who would keep a straight face can please themselves. So how should we understand this preamble that begins with each of Töpffer's story?
This is Töpffer's way of warning you that odd things, impossible things, and outrageous things are going to happen in this story. And you can't apply the normal criteria you would to any piece of fiction. This is something new, which demands new criteria and a new attitude to them, and a readiness to laugh at anything, a readiness also to take on board impossible things that are happening all the time in this story, including the scientific parts, which I'm thinking that Goethe particularly, as himself an amateur scientist, would have appreciated in particular. He used it as a kind of signature on books which he did not sign with his own name. Occasionally he put RT below drawings, and it was known generally who the author was, but he didn't claim authorship himself. It's as if the characters sort of invented themselves. Quite a good description of their behavior, the behavior of people constantly reinventing themselves as they go along. And also he was perhaps anticipating opposite reactions to his stories. Some are going to say, oh, this is just too silly for words. This is not the sort of thing that my children should be reading. If the albums came into the hands of children, as they did, they were acquired one way or another by Töpffer's friends, who would pass them down the line among their children, among their clans, shall we say, handed around at parties and given to people who perhaps were at a party and couldn't find anything else to do than leaf through Töpffer album, which happened to be lying on the table.
What is your favorite character among all of Töpffer's picture stories, and why?
That's difficult to answer because they're all so good. The characters are also different. It's frequent, the name of the story given to the story, like Monsieur Pencil. Pencil starts with a figure who has made a drawing which is swept away by the wind into the atmosphere. And this becomes a way into complete, strange, dubious, cloudy realms, into different weathers. And this drawing is going to send us into strange parts of experience. The best known character in Töpffer is probably Monsieur Cryptogram, which is the one album which the verses were redone completely in Dutch for the Dutch market. And to this day, it is the only Töpffer story that everyone's heard of. Ask any Dutchman, what did you think about Monsieur Cryptogram when you had it as a child? They said, oh, yes, of course I had it as a child. Everyone had it as a child. It was marvelous. So cryptogram really was the most popular in the true sense of the word. It reached the most people, even if there were only children, succeeded with children. But if you look inside...
If you have enjoyed this episode so far and want to listen to the entire episode, you can subscribe at theglobalnovel.com/subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.